19. Politics and sex. 1. Human being is self-transcendence from unto God and from unto one another. How does the latter occur? The decisive point was developed with unprecedented power by Karl Barth, if with some unreliable concepts. God's address to us is the Son, who is the human person Jesus of Nazareth. To receive myself from God and be directed toward Him is therefore to receive myself from and be directed toward a fellow human. And it is to receive myself from and be directed toward a human person who precisely to be himself brings others with him. For Jesus as the Son is the man whose whole existence is his life for others. What concerns him, and that totally and exclusively, is that other person precisely as such. For this other is the object of the saving work in the doing of which he himself exists. We may simply adopt Karl Barth's conclusion: the humanity of every person consists in the determination of his or her being as being together with the fellow human. To view human being without the fellow human is to miss it altogether, for a human without the fellow human would eo ipso be alien to the man Jesus and so be precisely inhuman. Or we may put it so, more in the language of the previous chapter, the person as whom God is there for us, to evoke and be the object of our self-transcendence, is the crucified and risen Jesus of Nazareth. Therefore, in that we make a community with God, we make a human community as those for whom this Jesus died and for whom he now lives. If I depend upon the address of God, and am human in that I respond, just so I depend upon a communal human address and am human in that I respond. There is of course the alternative account Barth rejects, the posit that human persons are self-transcendent by themselves. This account would hardly seem at all plausible except as we fear the account just given, except as we do not want our freedom to depend on God and each other. It turns the relational event into an occult entity and claims self-transcendence as the private possession of the individual. I myself in myself possess a power, whatever that means, to go beyond myself. Modernity is constituted by boldness in making this claim, and postmodernity by despairing of it while still living according to it. But modernity did not create the claim itself from nothing. In the line of history here mostly considered, it began when Socrates identified his direction to eternity with his essential self, the soul. We may perhaps indulge in some phenomenological recapitulation of the relations just posited. You out there, some of my objects, are yourselves, objectively, subjects. As such, you in turn have me, quite straightforwardly, for your object. The same address and response by which we are thus subjects for each other establishes a shared world, a reality between us as the total referent of our discourse, to be an objective space in which we meet. I come to share your objects, one of which I am, as of course you come to share mine, one of which you are. My self-transcendence, my location outside and ahead of myself, is thus simply the fact that I share your exteriority to me and the possibilities this otherness poses to me. If I can see myself, it is because I see also from your focus of regard. If I can reform myself, it is because I am not captive to my judgments alone. If I can interpret myself, it is because I share your and others' relation to myself. The structure of our mutuality is constitutive of my personhood. Modernity's claim to reified self-transcendence must of course deny the epistemic relations just asserted. So John Locke, we may as rationally hope to see with other men's eyes, as to know by other men's understandings. So much as we ourselves consider and comprehend of truth and reason, so much we possess of real and true knowledge. The Enlightenment's empty individualism of freedom must be an individualism of knowledge as well. Here is another place where modernity has undercut itself, for on the basis of such empiricism anything like self-knowledge must become impossible, and self-transcendence must become empty self-questioning and arbitrary self-assertion, that is, what postmodernity supposes it to be. How, next, is the person as object identical with the person as subject, to be recognized by the subject as him or herself? Only in that you, insofar as you have me as an object, know this object as a subject, so that you address me as identically subject and object. As you then share with me your response to me, as you answer my address, I have myself, as the object identical with myself that does this. But that means that death is the key. For while I Live I cannot see my life whole, and so also cannot see the whole that would be constituted in the full coincidence of the subject I am with the object I see I am. I cannot do this because only when I had died could I look back at my life as a whole, but where death is I am not. There is the story of my life, in which it is decided who I am that has this life, only when the moving finger has written a last line, but then I am no longer there to read it. My life as such is there for me only in memory, and the moment of my death cannot be an item of my memory. Only for others will I be a shaped and finished whole, when I have died. Therefore, I have possible shape and wholeness for myself only insofar as others already now take me for their object, thereby anticipating my completed objectivity, and as they then communicate with me in this reflection. Only in conversation do I occupy a position from which to interpret my life as a coherent whole, a position from which as a living subject I can anticipate the dead object I will be, and so from which I can grasp the identity of the I that does this with the life I remember. Again, a negative possibility shows itself. I am dependent on others for the communication in which I can interpret my life as a possibly coherent whole, in which indeed I can grasp my subjective identity with my objectively remembered life. As things stand, this dependence must inevitably be experienced as a threat, the very threat that makes us flee to the individualist account of human self-transcendence. For others may so address me as to bind me to their anticipation of my completed self, the object I will be when I am dead, and so close my freedom. Our discourse will then be the deadly chatter of a mass society. Or others may lie to me about myself and so free me to arbitrary self-invention. Our discourse will then be the mutual co-setting of moral atoms. Within late modernity and post-modernity these two catastrophes coincide, we call the coincidence fascism. I fear manipulation and lies from others because I suspect that others are themselves manipulated and lied to, depersonalized and adrift. I suspect this precisely because I have been manipulating and lying to them. How this circle of alienated collectivity began to turn is the mystery of original sin. We can give no reason why human discourse should have begun so. But once the circle is turning, it clearly cannot stop, unless something intervenes. 2. It is time to return to concrete positions already won and begin again from them. We are the praying animals, just so we are essentially communal animals. Because the very call that creates us summons us toward the God who calls, our hearts are indeed, as Augustine said, ontologically restless. We can each of us never find him or herself in the self she or he already is, though we can of course try, which is yet a mode of sin. If I am created by a word from beyond me, I must hearken to what is beyond me, and then I hear not only God but you. Or rather, appropriating results of the previous chapter, I hear you in hearing God. In the church I hear God's gospel from the mouth of his witnesses, and in the world I hear God's law from the mouth even of those of his counterparts who do not rightly identify him. If I pray, and pray with ritual embodiment, I just thereby become publicly available, and so available to you, even should my prayer itself be misaddressed. We will develop resultant political theory in conversation with the chief work of Christian politics to date, the De Civitate Dei of St. Augustine. Augustine's theory posits a great division. There is the heavenly polity, and there are earthly polities. The heavenly polity, whose interim earthly reality is the church, is the original polity, and earthly polities are stopgaps in view of sin. In the first man the foundations were laid, with respect to the human race, of two societies or polities, the one by Adam's creation, the other in view of his fall. Indeed, the true polity was created before humanity, with angels for its citizens, and was thus antecedently waiting to receive us. The principle of the earthly polity is violence, the necessary but self-contradictory securing of peace by war, yet this earthly polity also is God's instrument. An eminent Augustinian, Martin Luther, varied Augustine's theory in illuminating fashion. According to his exegesis of Genesis, the community of the church is coeval with and indeed constitutive of humanity. The church was founded, according to Luther's fancy, in paradise when God arbitrarily picked a tree as the temple and altar by relation to which humanity would have opportunity to hear, obey, and give thanks for God's word, or not. The economy appears only later when there are two to divide labor. Thus Luther sets the church within what would be the classic pairing of polity and economy and makes the church occupy the place of an original polity. Polities other than the church, in which God rules by law and associated compulsion, appear only in the situation of sin. Returning to Augustine himself, the ultimate good, insofar as it is not simply the person of God, is peace. Augustine provides a general definition of peace as the tranquility of order. Unforced mutual service between beings ordered to each other by their differences. Whether between creator and creature, between spiritual creatures and corporeal, or between those differently gifted or placed within the community of spiritual creatures. The authentic peace of a human polity is then the ordered concord of citizens, constituted in leading and obeying, a leading and obeying that are precisely not a dominion or servitude. And the peace of the original and final polity, which in its earthly journey and struggle is the church, is the perfectly ordered and concord society constituted in enjoying God and one another in God. Thus the two actual polities are ordered by differing objects of love. Two loves make the two polities, love of self the earthly polity, love of God the heavenly. Communal love of God is actual as right worship, in which the true polity adheres to God, whether now by faith or eternally by sight. Love of self has communal form as lust for dominion. Libido dominandi. For a society to love itself first is to seek to turn other societies to its own service. Just so such a society is determined also in its own life by this passion, since what it desires is to rule, it is itself ruled by this lust for rule. In the heavenly polity, citizens mutually serve in love. The earthly polity is necessarily dominated by its princes, those in whom the constitutive libido dominandi is most powerful. If what unites citizens is love of the one God of all, they are just so bound together in love, they enjoy one another in God. If they have no such encompassing love, there is no such transcendent basis for community. Self-loving persons can only be a multitude associated by rational consent jointly to pursue particular goods, the universal good not being available. If we are isolated in self-love, we can together be a polity, or a sort of polity, only by contract, as modern theory will name Augustine's. Rational consent, and in a state that understands itself so, those whose own self-love is strongest will inevitably dominate. The earthly polity, it seems, is a sort of substitute for the true polity. It is the best that can be provided without common worship of the one God. Augustine adopts a definition cited by Cicero from Scipio, thus co-opting great Roman authorities, that for a collectivity to be an authentic polity, a residential publica, our republic, it must be a residential populi. It is always hard to translate residential in a given context. Thing is the first and usually misleading dictionary entry, but the current idiom that speaks of an individual or group doing its thing in fact suggests itself here. We may translate Scipio's requirement, a true public thing must be a people's thing, its own defining project and passion. Scipio next defines a people. It is a fellowship of persons associated by consent in law. And finally, Scipio sets a limiting condition for consent in law. This cannot occur except where there is antecedent justice. It is justice that makes social contract to consent in law, and justice is therefore not itself constituted by the procedure of contract or by the positive law established in contract. For social consent to constitute a true polity, the consent must already be itself righteous in its content, a consent in and to antecedently practice justice. Rome, says Augustine, was therefore by its own strict definition never a true polity, because its state was never the project of a people so defined, of an intrinsically just community. Only on the less stringent definition, which allows us people to be constituted not in justice but merely by contract jointly to pursue certain common interests, was there ever a Roman people and so a Roman republic. If we follow Augustine, we will understand politics as the joint moral deliberation of a community, the process of its consenting in justice or at second best to a formal simulacrum of justice. There are ethical reasonings and choices to be made not only by individuals but antecedently by communities. Thus we will, for example, shortly urge that sexuality must be socialized as monogamy. But if monogamy is universally mandatory, it is far from universally inevitable. In an actual society its desirability may have to be argued and its establishment agreed and enforced. The effort, moreover, may fail. Politics are the process of such deliberation. The substance of communal morality is a specific discourse, in which the agreements and disagreements are between those who assert and those who deny propositions of the form our community should in future. Politics, in the original and only useful acceptation of the word, is a community's argument with itself about what to teach in schools, about the proper division of wealth, about what punishment fits what crime, about when if ever to use force with other communities and what force to allow ourselves, and so on. The polity is the forum in which such discourse can occur and terminate in decision, whether this is a meeting of all citizens, a monarch's bed, a representative assembly, a club of optimates, or whatever. That is to say, politics are the process of that mutual moral address by which, as we saw earlier, God speaks to us to initiate and sustain humanity. The polity is nothing less than the public space in which God calls us to be human, in that we call each other to come together in justice. To be sure, if we are to say so glorious a thing of politics, we must indeed use the word strictly in the original acceptation. It is itself a chief symptom of late and postmodern society's debility, and of the distortion of humanity within them, that we are likely to use the word very differently. There can be a collective of persons and a state apparatus with little real politics. An absolute ruler may repress deliberation of what ought to be done, even with himself, follow precedent, whim, ideology or pure interest, and manage affairs for a time and after a fashion. Recent evidence that it can only be for a time and after a fashion is provided by the collapse of the Stalinist empire. An isolated tribal community may live with little awareness that it reasons morally until an outer world poses questions that its customs do not master. A ruling class, united by pre-moral interest, may live as innocently as any tribe, again until upset from outside itself. Indeed, the specifically modern societies that began in hope for the greatest possible expansion of politics, that is, for democracy, seem now driven to a sort of neo-tribal existence. The present near extinction of politics in America, the most structurally modern of nations, is often noted, the multifarious and empowered citizen assemblies of the time before its civil war, and the citizen amateur representatives and higher officials for which its federal and state constitutions were designed, are scarcely a memory. What Americans are likely now to call politics is in fact the functioning of an almost entirely depoliticized collectivity and state, the manipulation of a mass of petitioners and their interests by professional managers of affairs. If there is now a functioning American polity, it is the very tight oligarchy of the federal judges. Also, in a collective whose communal moral discourse is rare or repressed, the managers will of course need to weigh the various interests of the multitude. Even pure dictatorships cannot long function at clear cross purposes with dominant mass wants. In a modern nation it is, for example, in the interest of investors that inflation be suppressed and of borrowers that it have some latitude, and those who have power in such a nation must weigh these opposing interests. But it is only in that somewhere in the community such interests are argued as possible goods, and not merely weighed as interests, that there is a functioning polity. The proposition that politics are the process of moral discourse by which community is created and sustained is true generally and not just of the Church. We have already investigated how God's creating address occurs in the various public things amid which the Church finds herself. We therefore say with Augustine that it finally is God who establishes and rules also earthly polities. Is there anything more discriminating to say? Augustine is not here so helpful as we might wish. He says that since earthly polities are established by contract to seek particular goods, their worth will be determined by what goods these are, thus some earthly polities will be superior to others. A people that does not worship the true God nevertheless loves the peace proper to it, and this peace is not to be denigrated. Moreover, believers must serve earthly polities when they can, for the sake of human society, which they are not allowed to desert. Apparently the heavenly polity and earthly polities are not in Augustine's understanding quite so antithetically related as he sometimes seems to say. Indeed, Augustine even says that the old Roman virtues were gifts of God for the good of his creation. The libido dominandi itself can be a substitute for justice, to preserve the Roman Empire from the ills that destroyed its predecessors, and so to benefit his creation. God gave Rome individuals who served the glory of Rome because they identified their own glory with Rome's, and so for this one vice, the love of honor, eschewed economic greed and other socially more destructive vices. We may in general say that Augustine identifies the political problem as the problem of the center of some common object of love. A people must be gathered by something if there is to be any sort of consent. The question is, by what? A sort of hierarchy of polities appears, ranked by what is at their center. 3. In Augustine's analysis, the only polity fully satisfying the earthly polity's own definition of authenticity is that republic whose founder and governor is Christ, which in this age is the Church. Contrary, however, to what modern prejudice may lead us to expect, Augustine does not then describe the Church as a theocracy, a polity ruled by priests or shamans. Indeed, it seems to be Augustine's understanding that because the true polity's center is God in Christ, it otherwise needs no dominating figures at all. Its politics, insofar as Augustine here describes them, are a mutuality of service in which rankings and differentiations rest upon and further mutual justice and are simply enjoyed in tranquility. If we try to characterize Augustine's true polity in more modern terms, the language cannot be avoided. It is an organic democracy. In it, moral discourse is sustained mutually by persons enjoying varying gifts and offices, between whom what elsewhere would be dominion and servitude has no such tone. It is clear what text Augustine has always in mind: among the Gentiles those whom they recognize as their rulers lord it over them. But it is not so among you, but whoever wishes to become great among you must be your servant. In the heavenly polity, Jeremiah's prophecy has been fulfilled from before the creation: no longer shall they say to each other, know the Lord, for they all know me, from the least of them to the greatest. The heavenly polity is the community prophesied by Joel, in which all are prophets, as that community pre-exists in the apocalyptic seer's heaven and as it is temporally anticipated in Israel and the Church. The baptized have, in the vision of Hebrews, already come to the city of the living God, the heavenly Jerusalem. Democracy as actual organically structured sovereignty of the people would be the most political of communities and the most communal of polities. For apart from public moral deliberation, no demos exists to be sovereign. The people as such do not exist as a personal agent except insofar as they are joined in mutual ascertainment of the good, for the people as such have no common interest and so can be joined only by a common good. It is only as deliberation transforms interests into convictions and commitments that an eventual general consensus or vote can manifest one sovereign will of the people. Such free deliberation is not dangerous to the position of Christ within his church, but is always very dangerous to representatives and officials. Would-be democracies, including the temporally struggling church, are therefore always tempted to avoid the more vital and so more upsetting sorts of public moral discourse by, with Rousseau, positing a pre-moral will of the people that obtains prior to discourse and needs only to be uncovered, whether by a divinatory leader gifted to know and enforce it or by a mechanistic counting device. Late modern history has sufficiently demonstrated the disastrous character of such totalitarian democracy. It may of course be doubted that the temptation can be resisted, that an actual democracy can long endure on this earth. We have leaped from the best to the worst of polities, both now called democracy. Subsequent to the true polity in Augustine's own interpretation is the republic constituted by contract to pursue particular goods and just so ruled by one sort or another of dominant persons. The religion and structure of such a polity are paired. As the objects of such a polity's passion are creatures, so it is permanently tempted to idolatry. As its love is foundationally for itself, so it is tempted to recruit divine help for earthly dominion, reversing the true order. The good use the world in order to enjoy God, evil persons on the contrary try to use God in order to enjoy the world. And as it pursues earthly goods that are plural, so it is led to the formal structure of idolatry, that is, polytheism. Nevertheless, despite this theologically baleful assessment, Augustine, as we have seen, does not think all earthly polities are equally distant from justice or true religion. Beyond an obvious admiration for the ancient virtues of his own republic, he does not, however, provide much by which to measure the distances. The next few paragraphs state a theory that cannot be fathered on Augustine. The most powerful antecedent to these paragraphs, and their Closest parallel are analyses provided by Paul Tillich in early essays, written in the turmoil of the Weimar Republic, here acknowledged once for all and not cited in detail. It follows from the positions developed in this and previous chapters, a polity is the context of divine mandate. It is the forum of that word by which the community's humanity and that of its members is created. The goodness of a polity, we may suggest, is its openness to this analogue of prophecy. A polity, we have said, is the arena in which a community's ethics are done, in which the question is posed, with possibility of effective decision, what ought our community do about? For long stretches of a community's life, its life may be wholly guided by established maxims and its moral reflection therefore not apparently prophetic. But the facts of temporality and other peoples make it certain that new moral knowledge and understanding will someday be needed, as when medical technology continuously reduces the term of fetal viability, demanding of liberal America that it face facts which could once be suppressed and with which it seems unable now to deal. Then the community will spin in a moral void unless it hearkens to the mandating bite of its own moral discourse, to the address of God that is the spring and content of its own moral deliberation. There are what may be called pre-political questions, consensus in which is presupposed by the very decision procedures that constitute a polity, alike whether these are elaborate republican legal procedures or the arbitration of a chieftain between combatants. Such questions demand decision about who in fact is a member of the polity, as does, for example, the question of involuntary or problematically voluntary euthanasia. And they therefore cannot themselves be politically adjudicated, they require a word of mandate. A polity is good insofar as it provides for the speaking of such mandates, for it to be said among the people, this is the will of heaven. A society's religion marks the spot where this happens. This is by no means a general approbation of religion. Nearly all religions are straightforwardly fictitious, there is, thank the true God, no Moloch or great goddess, and all religion, Jewish and Christian included, is used by its devotees to evade and drown out the word from God by which it is called. As already promised, we will return to these points. But even those who cry, Lord Moloch, cannot evade thereby confronting the Lord. They risk hearing, you called? I am the Lord. But my name is not Moloch and I do not savor the smoke of your children. The Lord's word in such an evil society includes condemnation, but even in that case, so long as the society lives it will be from this word that it lives. If we are to rank polities, therefore, we will say that the better polity is the one that, first, is gathered by a less wicked religion, and that, second, more cultivates its community's religion while less recruiting it to the libido dominandi. A good polity is one that institutionalizes space for divine mandates challenged precisely to its own established consensus. The evaluative principle here offered thus turns out to be a generalization of a traditional Western Catholic teaching about the relation of church and state. But by being made applicable to all polities, simply as they are polities, the doctrine ceases to be interpretable merely as a proposition about polities that happen to have the church in their midst and is revealed as a claim about what makes a collective a polity in the first place. The generalization is sustained by the sort of argument just practiced, that locates polity in the conversation between the triune God and his counterpart creatures, a conversation always in progress whether acknowledged or not. Finally, in Augustine's language a possibility shows itself more horrid than any he himself could envision. He speaks of earthly polity as constituted in coitus rationalis, which might be translated rational contract. The word contract is of course the fateful word of modern social theory. It signals among other things the notion of a polity with something rather than someone at its center, constituted chilly in impersonal procedures of consent. We have arrived yet again at the great modern antagonist of the doctrine of creation, mechanism. The United States was in position to make the experiment. James Madison and his fellow political engineers believed that the great improvements that the science of politics has received enable construction of a state machinery that would produce the blessings of justice and liberty independently of the justice and devotion to freedom of those who are the polity's cogs and levers. By principles analogous to the Newtonian laws of action and reaction, they set out to balance interest against interest and center of power against center of power in a system that should be an analogy of the cosmos supposedly described by Newton. They were not such mechanists as to think that the polity machine would run indefinitely without virtue in the people, something very like Augustine's justice was presupposed. But they sought to depersonalize the state itself. Only the most perspicacious analysts then suspected what would come of this, the closing of the polity to the moral discourse that is its own proper matter and basis. But that was the inevitable outcome, for only persons speaking not for interests but for their own moral judgment can conduct authentic moral discourse, representatives of other persons who are not there, and functionaries in office can only conduct a weighing of interests. Thus the American people's moral discourse was first exiled to a sort of surrogate polity, an alternative public sphere of reform movements and educational and charitable enterprises created by evangelical Protestantism, and then starved also in that exile, as the state in the 20th century has steadily attacked the legitimacy and power of the civil society. Here is the place where we must notice the modern consort of the polity, the separately describable economy. Persons are economic agents insofar as their mutual agency is not guided by decision about what should be done but rather by an indeed quasi-Newtonian balancing of interests. Let us suppose, for example, that a municipality has in one way or another come to political decision about reducing the level of pollution in a river running through it. Then industries, workers, and taxpayers in their pre-moral reflections, and indeed a politically untrackable congeries of affected groups or individuals, will necessarily and quite without room for moral decision, weigh in with their interests, and a balance of taxes, imposts, regulations, wage levels, and so on, will eventually emerge. Thus, the economy is the human collectivity insofar as it is a sphere of natural necessity like the solar system or the ecosystem. Economics, or, as it is better named, political economy, is an attempted analogue of the natural sciences, and a much closer analogue than the alleged science of politics that the American founders invoked. The economy, we may say, is the community insofar as it accepts the short-term, seemingly mechanistic, continuities of history as binding also for it. The economy is the human community insofar as it does not take up its freedom. Short of the kingdom, the community will have this character also. Just so we are returned to Augustine's central contention, the political problem is solved only in a polity whose founder and governor is God. Its permanent solution can therefore only be eschatological. No polity of this age can be more than a temporary, because inwardly self-subverting, arrangement. No earthly polity can be established that can itself resolve its own pre-political questions, such as the contemporary American conflict about death. Modernity's liberal polities, for example, embody our religious principles of equality and procedure, devised precisely to adjudicate between the pre-political convictions of contending religions, and they have fulfilled this mission well. But just so they cannot adjudicate between religion and secularism, since they are themselves among the principles of secularism. Finally, the eschatological solution will have a specificity that Augustine did not quite give it. It is precisely because God is triune that we can be one in Him. This specific God and He alone can be both a personal center for His creatures and a system of relations in which they can be directly related to each other. This God can even be understood as a system of checks and balances. Centered on Him, we are both centered on a person and centered on no individual. We are rescued alike from depersonalization and domination. 4. One question remains on this line: what is the content of that justice that according to Augustine plays so decisive a role? Augustine says little material to the matter, apparently presuming that not only his Christian but his old Roman readers would sufficiently understand. We can now make no such presumption. We turn to the 10 Commandments. These commandments explicitly present themselves as a description of the justice proper to God's polity. They state the moral content of the Lord's intention to create Israel as a distinct nation. The first table of commandments thus directly enjoins the communal adherence to the one God, which for Augustine is the heart of true justice. Exclusive devotion to Yahweh is first stipulated, then the essential marks of His proper cult, which are worship without His putative image, care instead for His name, and observance of the Sabbath. Then follow the commandments of the second table, which are to constitute the justice of Israel's mutual life. Here a decisive duality of function appears. These commandments are mostly negative in their explicit formulation, defining sorts of crime. But communities, of course, do not flourish merely by avoiding crimes, they cohere by positive virtues shaped in and to the course of their histories. Thus, the history of Israel and the Church fills the commandments of the second table with positive meaning which is not apparent in their text, if they are taken out of the narrative in which they are reported and so read as sheer prohibitions. In their bare negative formulation, on the other hand, the commandments of the second table apply to all polities, including those that do not belong to the narrative in which the commandments appear and that must therefore substitute joint pursuit of self-interest for love of God. In this role the commandments state minimum conditions. No society can subsist in which the generations turn against each other, in which vendetta has not been replaced by public organs of judgment and punishment, in which the forms by which sexuality is socialized, whatever these may be, are flouted, in which property, however defined, is not defended, in which false testimony is allowed to pervert judgment, or in which greed is an accepted motive of action. Indeed, even the commandments of the first table have a kind of negative and so general application. No society can long subsist that violates its own religion. Whether or not we wish to call the commandments in this negative abstraction natural law is perhaps mostly a matter of conceptual taste. The commandments are explicitly given by God to Israel and the Church, but any people must know them in their negative mode if it is indeed to be a people even by less stringent definition. And existing people show that they do know them. We must adduce at least one actual instance of the way in which the commandments specify minimal justice, and at the present moment of Western history there is little choice about what this must be. A society in which an unborn child can legally be killed on the sole decision of the pregnant person cannot be a people even by the least rigorous of Augustine's definitions. It can only be a horde. As a universally forceful negative command, "You shall not kill," specifies the decisive break between pre-civil and civilized society, the replacement of vendetta by courts and their officers. The decision that someone rightly must die is no longer to be made by interested parties and is instead to be made by maximally disinterested communal organs. The someone in question is of course a member of the human community in question, who is within the scope of its law. If unborn children are members of the human community, then allowing abortions to be performed on decision of the most interested party is a relapse to pure barbarism. The only question then is, are unborn children members of the human community? The unanswerable argument is provided by Roe v. Wade itself, the decision that undid American public morality. The justices of the American Supreme Court had it right at the beginning of their decision. There is no plausible way to draw a line across the development of the unborn child before which it is not a human person and after which it is. But what follows is quite obviously the opposite of the law the justices laid down. Unless interfered with, the child will at some time be a human person, and if at any given point in its development we cannot know that she or he is not yet that, what we do not at that point possess is any justification for treating the child as other than a member of the community, embraced in society's protection from private decisions to kill. The argument just conducted is an argument in a natural law if ever there was one. It should be comprehensible and convincing to any rational person. But in late modern societies it is not. When abortion is the subject, few outside the remaining Orthodox Christian congregations and conservative or Orthodox synagogues are capable of reason. The result of American polling is uniform. Most Americans believe both that abortion for other than exceptional reasons is the unjust taking of a human life and that women should have the right to procure abortion for any reason that compels them. That is, the American people have in this matter abdicated moral coherence. The commandments are given to the church and synagogue. The world's public things are neither survive without these same commandments nor reliably endure them in the rational rigor even of their merely negative import. Therefore, again, of no polity other than synagogue or church can it be said that the gates of hell will not prevail against it. 5. In themselves, most commandments of the second table are generally accepted. However their application may at key points be burked, it is still widely granted that a society will not flourish in which property is regularly at risk, or in which the killing of human persons is anyone's prerogative but the community's, or in which justice is perverted, or in which greed is unrestrained. But can we say this of "you shall not commit adultery"? Does the polity indeed have a vital interest in what, as it is now said, consenting adults do in the privacy of their bedrooms. We come to the second topic of this chapter. Earlier ethical systems regularly made sexual ethics the longest chapter. It has more recently become fashionable, also in churchly circles, to think that surely there are weightier matters of the law, to which attention should instead be given. But the older tradition had the better insight, not because chastity is more intrinsic to righteousness than is, for example, economic fairness, but because other modes of justice are not achievable in a generally unchaste society. It is for this reason that this chapter pairs the matters named in its title. To repeat Position's earlier one, it is only in that I am there for you as an object, as a body, that I can also be a subject for you, that is, that human freedom occurs. Human being in its self-transcendence is posited in community, and community depends upon bodily givenness, in my reality for you and for myself as this particular something available to your intention. We must now note a point not earlier made much of. Prior to the resurrection, my embodiment is of course not separable from a biological organism, or is only exceptionally. Even the spiritual body of which Paul speaks, insofar as it is anticipated in baptism, is not now separable from an organic body, as indeed appears repeatedly in Paul's constructions. This organism, which under modern conditions I am likely misleadingly to call my body without qualification, is appropriately to its role a marvelous thing. Its chief marvel is its sexuality. For present purposes, sexuality may be said to have two components. The one is sensuality, the common denominator of perception, of the subject's awareness of an other and captivation by that awareness. Sensuality, we may say, is the sheer fact that the subject is drawn to an object, it is captivation by touching and seeing and hearing and smelling and tasting. The other is humanity's provision with bisexual reproductive apparatus. A presupposition of the history in which human nature is enacted is the provision of new humans in succession. The Creator has arranged, surely his most humorous idea, that this provision shall take place in consequence of an act performed between humans of two bodily kinds. These kinds are objectively distinguished from and directed to one another by sheer plumbing, inescapably. The vagina and the penis are made for each other. Sexuality is the coincidence of sensuality and objective male-female differentiation. It is the location of the most intense sensuality of which we are capable in the plumbing by which humanity is divided into two mutually fitted kinds. This union brings it about, on the one hand, that the apparatus of reproduction does not work impersonally, but that I live in the event as a captivated subject of that objective other whose different body presents him or her to me. And the union brings it about, on the other hand, that the subject's captivation by an object does not float freely to alight where it may, but is directed to a determinate other, picked out by an objective difference from the object self of the subject. Sexuality is therefore the way in which our directedness to each other, the intrinsic commonality of human being, is built into the very objects as which we are there for one another. It is sexuality that rescues the communal character of human being from being a mere ideal or demand laid upon us and makes it a fact about us. Karl Barth was the pioneer in this insight. The human person has no choice whether to be co-human or something else. Human being just has this basic form. And this is made inescapable by the circumstance that we cannot say human without saying a man or woman, as also a man and woman. It is for this reason that humanity is not an ideal and not a virtue. It is for this reason and this reason only that politics and the political mandate of justice are givens of human existence and not mere options or ideals. We may simply adopt Barth's Theologumena. The woman is for the man the eminent, co-human, and the man is this for the woman. In and with existence as human and as this specific human, each one is man or woman. This distinction and relation is of all human distinctions the decisive one, for only it is structural. Because we are female and male, we are directed as subjects to each other by the very objects that we are for each other, and we are so directed by objective differences between those objects. Sexuality is the factuality of that intention of one another as objects which is our reality as subjects. For my femaleness or maleness is constituted not in malleable or contingent psychology or social construction but in the shape of the body I am, which can be hated and even mutilated but cannot actually be given the shape of its counterpart, not even by the most sophisticated technology. Thus sexuality is the fact of that identity of subject and object that is the peculiar structure of humanity. In Genesis' first creation story, when God created man, he created them male and female. Man as a singular is equivalent to them, male and female as a plural. This lapidary identification is a compressed version of the extended Yahwistic narrative that follows. In the longer story, God says, "It is not good that the man should be alone, I will make him a helper as his partner." The word here translated good is the one that appears in the first accounts. Judgments that, it was good. Thus the ordination of humanity to its purpose, without which no creature is yet itself, is not accomplished in either man so long as he is alone. The man is good, and were he not good he would not exist, only when there is the sexual other. The creation narratives contemplate no such thing as a humanity that is not female humanity or male humanity, each in relation to the other. That we find and make many difficulties with our maleness or femaleness does not alter the fact of them. As the sort of fact it is, a fact that enables communal subjectivity, our maleness or femaleness is also a task and opportunity, and one which we rarely conduct well. Our femaleness or maleness does not therefore lapse. This is both our rescue from final disaster and a rock on which we often stumble. 6. We move to certain consequences of sexuality's role in human being. A first is to ground a platitude: the family is the essential institution of any community. More precisely, the family is necessary to the existence of the polity. It is what saves the famous political imperative, "Come, let us reason together," from being a mere and then certainly vain exhortation. The institutionalization of sexuality is the foundation of all communal institutionalization. The laws that regulate sexuality, that stipulate what constitutes a family and enforce its integrity, are therefore a condition of all other lawmaking. As the community establishes and grasps itself by consent in law, legislation about sex is the necessary first step. Only very determined thoughtlessness could believe what is now common opinion: what someone does in bed is not the law's business, so long as no one is hurt. On the contrary, what I do in bed is the area of my action in which the community has the most urgent interest, the area for which it must legislate if it is to legislate at all. It is not meant that if the late modern West's dissolution of sexual law were carried to the end, there would not still be libraries of constitutions and statutes. What is being lost is the law's legitimacy, its purchase in Augustine's justice, or indeed in Scipio's second best contract. A community establishes the right of its law by its willingness to legislate for itself at that point where its own being is at stake. We may get at the matter so: sexuality is the reality test of law. Every discourse tends to its own sort of dreaming arbitrariness, and must be checked by encounter with an appropriate sort of stubborn fact. Willingness and ability to regulate sexuality is lawmaking's test of this sort. There is a motto of conventional nihilism: mastery, not truth, makes law. Where law avoids sexuality, the motto states the lamentable fact. Where law fails its reality test, it is indeed but a product of dominance. And law that can claim no other justification than the decision of its makers can be maintained only by essentially arbitrary power. A totalitarian state is one in which a major part of law is in this condition. When we first notice these connections between sexuality and politics, moderns are likely to be much bewildered. Let the offense be at least well directed. We should deprecate the recent sexual revolution not so much for the behavior released, pitiful though most of it is, as for its consequences as a political choice. A sexually anarchic society cannot be a free society. For no society can endure mere shapelessness. When the objective foundation of community is systematically violated, the society must and will hold itself together by arbitrary force. Nor is this analysis an exercise in theoretical reasoning, it merely points out what is visibly happening in late 20th century Western societies. To derive a second consequence of sexuality's humanizing role, we must note a particular connection between terms now established in our discourse: promise and visibility. A wholly disembodied word, were such a thing possible, could still be law but could not be a promise. Visible words are speech with the body, with the object self, and my objective self is what binds me to the conditions that impede my commitments. When, to retrieve the earlier example, I say to my child, I will send you to college, my actually doing so is conditioned by a vast web of circumstance. My bondage to these is my body, my availability, and so vulnerability to the world out there. If my statement is a promise, what makes it so is that I brave some of those conditions. Making a promise is therefore always an overcoming of the promise's mere circumstantial objectivity. We may say, making a promise is always somehow a jolt to the body, a specific mobilization of this in itself communally immobile thing. An act of communication that says, I will take care of it for you, inwardly includes a movement of the body to the one addressed, an overcoming of distance. Since the body is from this point of view the sum of the impediments to promise keeping, promises are made binding. By their embodiment, by their actuality as visible and not merely audible words. We make promises with a handshake, a kiss, a signature, or a seal. God promises His kingdom with a toast, His life with an invigorating wash. Intercourse is the ultimate creaturely gesture of this sort, the movement of my body to the other that cannot be surpassed without harmful consequences. For here the one body actually engulfs the other and that body enters the first, only in this active abolition of distance to be mutually the bodies they are. Therefore if intercourse is a gesture and not a mere technique of sensation or reproduction, it can be the embodiment of an ultimate promise, the promise of myself if it kills me, of shared life until death do us part. I can promise no particular thing unconditionally, for I possess no particular thing certainly, without reservation I can promise only myself. Yet nor do I possess myself until I am dead, and then the promised self is withdrawn. Therefore I give myself to you, until death parts us, is the closest approach to unconditional promise in the power of a creature. I may, to be sure, fail to keep also this promise. But if I do, this is mere failure, nothing can prevent me, for death is the last sanction and death is already accepted by the promise made. Just so it is the promise that only the final gesture of intercourse can embody. Clearly I cannot make this promise a second time without thereby breaking the first, for I have only one death to give. So also this promise includes in itself the promise not so to address another. That is, if intercourse says what it alone can say, it says faithfulness. Therewith we have named the chief Jewish and Christian virtue in this realm. We can of course stipulate together that intercourse shall be the sign of a lesser address. We can make it be the gestural embodiment of I am yours forever, maybe, or I am yours for this pleasant weekend. But then we have no gesture left for final commitment, and so become incapable of it. A society in which this was a widespread condition could not long cohere. We can even arrange that intercourse shall promise nothing at all, that it be a sheer technique. This arrangement makes the sexual structure of fascism. Utterly to silence intercourse is to drive the objective basis of community below the level of communal consciousness. A society in this condition can be held together only by arbitrary leadership and force. Totalitarian politics and sexual liberation are but two sides of one phenomenon. A third and in this chapter last consequence of humanity's sexuality is already in fact established. A just society will encourage and insofar as possible enforce heterosexual monogamy as the paradigmatic socialization of sexuality. The precautions built into that proposition should be noted. It is not here asserted that polygamous societies cannot function, or that love cannot flourish in other forms of marriage, or that monogamous polities can enforce monogamy with equal rigor under all circumstances, or how the sensual impulses of those who identify themselves as homosexual should be socialized, or that any socialization of sexuality or sensuality guarantees happiness or its own success. It is not accidental that most openly polygamous societies are traditional tribal societies. In a community in which behavior is determined by rules supposed to have descended unchangeably from the beginning, the objective base of society can remain below the level of communal consciousness and law. In that situation, sexuality may be socialized apolitically. Most often this will then be done obediently to herd biology and so polygynously. In cases where historical polity is achieved without altering these arrangements, women will be excluded from the polity. Short of the kingdom, even monogamous communities will doubtless be compelled to admit divorce in some instances, and so a modicum of serial polygamy. Even in the biblical canon, the absolute prohibition remembered from Jesus was amended. But a measure of a community's humanity will be its effort to restrict divorce, and a measure of other evils in the community will be the need to ease the restriction and let the pressure escape here. Divorce for adultery is the obvious first concession, since with an unrepentant adulterer one cannot live monogamously. Moreover, it must be recognized that staying with the spouse may indeed kill, and that society cannot require martyrdom, not even the church can require it. It must even be recognized that the death to be avoided may be moral or spiritual, though here casuistry must proceed slowly and cautiously. But only humanity's trivializers will fail to mourn the ontological loss inflicted by even these concessions. Finally, the inclusion of heterosexual in the rule is a, perhaps now necessary, redundancy. For homoeroticism is of course not a mode of sexuality at all, but an escape from it. Homoeroticism is a group of sensual techniques, devised to abstract sexuality's pleasure without commitment to its function. Doubtless these are sometimes used also as visible words of affection. There could not be a monogamy, or polygamy, other than heterosexual. Talk of same-sex marriage is a mere triumph of Humpty Dumpty. We need not here resolve the question of whether there are such things as sensual orientations, and if so, how they are acquired. What must anyway be clear is that homosexuality, if it exists and whatever it is, cannot be attributed to creation. Those who practice forms of homoerotic sensuality and attribute this to homosexuality cannot refer to the characteristic as the way God created me, if create has anything like its biblical sense. No more in this context than in any other do we discover God's creative intent by examining the empirical situation. As we have seen, I may indeed have to blame God for that empirically present in me that contradicts his known intent, but this is an occasion for unbelief, not a believer's justification of the evil. Abstention from sexuality is not in itself an evil. Indeed, one of the blessings enabled by the Church's anticipation of the kingdom is that celibacy can be a specific vocation within her. Nor is deprivation of sexuality a sin. Abstention or deprivation is not, however, the same as defection. 7. The tone would contradict the matter were we so to end our discussion of sexuality. We may recoup with another piece of Luther's beguiling exegesis of Genesis. It was very different. Then, before sin, when Adam and Eve were absorbed in God's goodness and justice, there was then between the two of them a marvelous conjunction of spirit and will. Nothing in the whole world was sweeter or more charming for Adam than his Eve. Had they remained so captivated by God and each other, the intimate relation between man and wife would have been purely delightful. The act of procreation particularly would have been sacred and highly esteemed, accompanied by lofty delight and done without hiding. And we may summarize the entire chapter with a proposition parallel to that which ended the previous chapter. As love is the fulfillment of our self-transcendence toward God, so it is also the fulfillment of our self-transcendence toward one another. Jesus said, "You shall love the Lord your God." This is the first commandment. And a second is, like it, you shall love your neighbor as yourself. On these two commandments hang all the law and the prophets. Yet Jesus does not say of our love for each other what he says of our love for God, that it may be with all our heart and soul and mind. He mandates only such love for each other as we have for ourselves. Therefore, in our transcendence toward one another, the equivalence between love and faith does not hold as it does in our transcendence toward God. We can have saving faith neither in one another nor in ourselves. Precisely with that negation, this chapter must end.